And this will finish up the lesson from these verses that the prophecy here that's detailed in this is, there's so much. 3 lessons doesn't cover it. I don't know how many lessons it would take to cover all this, because there's so much detail in every verse. Some verses have like multiple prophecies in one verse. There's so much to cover in all this, so 3 weeks really doesn't do it justice. I'm sure there's hundreds of sermons you could preach on from this chapter here as well. But says this lesson focuses more on the result of Christ's suffering. In this part, it's called the triumphant suffering of Messiah. But we'll start out in chapter 53 and verse 9, and I brought this up at the beginning, and I forgot where I read it, and then I went back over and over, and I found it and read it again. But in chapter 53 and verse 9, it says, "And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth." And Isaiah wrote the part of this verse that says he made his grave with the wicked. He was crucified, as we know, with two thieves, and they had entirely intended on burying him with those 2 thieves, as well as the guards and everything had entirely planned on burying him with those 2 thieves, and I would think it would be as another form of humiliation or something like that they would be wanting to do to him, is to bury him with the thieves, because all the other humiliation they put him through, and mocking and whatever it would be, that they had planned to do that. But this was taken care of way before, and as the prophecy was made by Isaiah. And it says in verse 9, it says, "And with the rich in his death," and it says Joseph of Arimathea, and it says a previously secret disciple and a rich man. And the first result of the Messiah's suffering then was that he received an honorable, over and over, I guess. It says, verse 10 and 11 says, "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. And by his knowledge shall my righteous servants justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities." It says, another result of Christ's suffering was the Father's satisfaction. Messiah's suffering and its accomplishments pleased God the Father. So we talked about that last week. And it's, you see some of this, and we talked about that in verse 10, in the first sentence there, "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him." And we question, why would it please God? And it does that in the lesson here. It says, how could God take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but be pleased by the death of his spotless Son? And he was pleased that it was an acceptable sacrifice. That's what pleased God, was the acceptable sacrifice. It wasn't the death, it was the acceptable sacrifice. That was the only acceptable sacrifice. God doesn't get pleasure in the death of anyone. But he does take pleasure in the acceptable sacrifice that Christ done, and the willing to do God's will, and everything that he done was perfect. And then it goes on to talking about the resurrection. And it says, although the Messiah's suffering culminated in his death, Isaiah 53:10 states, "He shall prolong his days." So this is where I was getting at. How many different prophecies is in each verse? And in verse 10, you can see it says, "He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand." The prolonging of the days is in reference to the resurrection. It says Isaiah anticipated that the Messiah would not only die, but he would also rise again. And in the first sermon preached after the crucifixion, Peter presented the resurrection of Jesus as proof that he was indeed the Messiah. And Peter quoted a psalm from David and pointed to David's tomb to prove that David had not been referring to his own resurrection as well, but to the Messiah's. And Christ taught about his resurrection in all four Gospels, and all the writers recorded it. But then this part we kind of touched on this before, as we have a bunch of this. And in verse 11, am I reading the right one? Yeah, verse his travail was productive. There it says in part C, it says, "He shall see the travail of his soul and shall be satisfied." And travail refers to labor pains of a woman while giving birth, and a woman giving birth to the child. So the pain Christ suffered gave birth to many children, and that makes a lot more sense, because we also talked about where did I read? Because he didn't. I know we've talked about that before, where he didn't have a seed, and right here it goes on it kind of out of context, or out of line here in our book, but it says, "Perhaps the greatest result of Christ's suffering, at least in the mind of a Christian, is the salvation it provided. Jesus Christ died without physical children, yet arose to produce spiritual children, all born through the agony of his suffering as an offering for sin," Isaiah wrote. "When thou shalt make this soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed." And that's in verse 10. When he went right there, and that's kind of goes back to the travail, where it connected it back with me with the travail, and it's talking about a woman giving birth, and the travail and the pain a woman goes through giving birth to her children. And that's what it's kind of comparing it to. It sounds like to me here as the travail and the pains he went through, and when it was over, his seed is all of us. Everyone that accepts Christ is his seed, and from that point forward, and we see everybody talks God says God the Father as a father, and it's the same situation here, is where as his where it says he shall see his seed is what it references here in verse 10, and it's all of us as his spiritual children is what it calls it here in the lesson. Does anyone have anything to add about that? And we'll get into the heirs and things like that. But anytime you think of someone as your children, all of us do with our children. We always want the best for them. That's God the Father has always struck a note with me. I guess more so after I had children, is the relationship between a father and his child, or a mother and their child, or anything like that. Especially with little children, they're always they long to please their parents. I guess you would say they get so much enjoyment out of pleasing their parents. If you think of any time you was a little kid, or anything like that your mom or your dad let you do something for them, how happy you was that you got to please your parents, that you got to do something for them. I think we lose a lot of that as we get older, but as little children, how they are always so happy to get to help mama or daddy do something. You know, they stand up and help mama wash dishes or whatever mom's doing, help her cook or do things like that, help dad with a car or help him in the yard or things like that. How happy kids are to help their parents. And seeing God the Father is thinking of God as a father and how happy we should be to be able to do His will, to do anything to help Him, and how happy He is at us to want to help and to look to Him as a father and to look to Him for direction. But I think that's always just stuck with me, the relationship of a father and a child between God the Father and us, of how much of a parallel, how much that goes together. But this lesson also goes here, and it talks about the perspective of these verses that we've been studying from Isaiah chapter 53. And I'd never looked at it like this, but it says it's given from the perspective of the Jews that were looking back at Christ's life and death after they had come to realize that He is their Messiah. So with that perspective, looking at this for the people that the people that originally read this, did they understand what was coming? Or if you're looking back at this as the perspective of the Jewish people after Christ's death, yeah, they seen this and I couldn't imagine what they thought, after Christ's death and the teachers and the leaders. I always bring up that one show I seen, and it had one of the priests or Sadducees or whatever they were in one of the shows, and he repeated something from here. He repeated a verse out of here. Out of Isaiah 53, as he was watching the crucifixion happen, and it dawned on him, and he remembered this verse or something. And I wonder if that really happened with a lot of them. If once it was over, once the crucifixion was over, or as they were standing there watching it, or as the day after, and they studied this stuff and taught the Old Testament all their lives. They knew all this prophecy and things like that. That's what they did. That was all they had to do. And like the day after, did they remember Isaiah 53 and was like, everything that's there just happened? We just witnessed all this happen. At what point did they? Because that's what it says here. It says it was written from the perspective of Jews looking back. Do you think that's kind of what it was? The perspective would be by looking at this, by the Jewish people looking back at the crucifixion after it happened. So, no.
Well, there was multitudes in Jerusalem that were saved after the resurrection.
Yeah.
The first Pentecost, thousands saved, and then shortly thereafter, 5,000 saved. And then shortly thereafter, they just called them a multitude.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know how many people were in Jerusalem that regularly lived there, but when you're talking probably 8,000 or 10,000 people that saved, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And everybody's going to know somebody.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't doubt what there wasn't some of those that, like you're talking about,
Yeah.
that were caught up in that revival.
Yeah, the actual priests and stuff that went out and started spreading the gospel because they said, hey, this just happened. We've seen this with our own eyes. This just happened. This is what we done. And them asking for forgiveness, even as it talks about here and in here we'll get to, and even what Christ said on the cross is to forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing, And but it talks about this some here, and it says even the kings shall shut their mouth at him, for what they had not been told, they shall see him. And Well, let me just read part of this here is in chapter 52. We didn't talk much about these 3 verses, but we're going to get to them more here. Let me read chapter 52, verse 13 through 15. It said, Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. So that exalted and extolled is high and lifted up, is kind of what it's saying there. It says, as many were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations, the kings shall shut their mouth at him, for that which they had not seen, had not been told them, shall they see, and that which they had not heard shall they consider. So that may be like what you're talking about. It's the word is going to travel fast, and they're going to hear what had happened, and they're going to recognize him for who he was or who he is.
After the resurrection, they're able to go back and, there's 300 plus prophecies in the Old Testament.
Right.
So after the resurrection, they're able, and I don't, why they didn't see it before.
Yeah.
But after he died, they're able to go back and say,
Yep.
this was a prophecy,
Yep.
it happened.
Yep.
This is a prophecy, it happened. This is a prophecy, and they can just go down the list.
And something I've always wondered too, like, because they were calling him, they were saying it was, heresy or whatever they called it, blasphemy and things like that, because some of the small things, like when he rode into Jerusalem on the donkey, I mean, that would have stuck out. They would have seen that, but they may have been so into whatever they were into that they just called it blasphemy, because they knew that's how the Messiah would arrive, but they didn't want to see it as that, and they were calling it blasphemy because he had done that. I don't know. But I mean, like you say, all of the different prophecies and all the things that were fulfilled. Yeah, once you look back on it, what is it? Hindsight's 20/20. And once you look back on it, you can see everything. You can. Everything had to just jump off of the page at them whenever they would look back and read anything or to see any of this. And then it goes on here in verse 15, and it's talking about, it says, so shall he sprinkle many nations. And it says, and we still know about some of the different denominations today still use the sprinkling. What is it, the Methodist that does sprinkling for baptism and things like that? It says, under the Levitical system, the priests use sprinkling to cleanse themselves. Sprinkling can also refer to the spiritual cleansing of Gentiles who put their trust in Jesus Christ. It says, from the beginning, this magnificent passage makes it evident that the Messiah will have a ministry that is not limited to the Jewish people, but extends to the Gentiles as well, thereby talking of the baptism and things like that. But now we get to the part where it says the promise of salvation here, and verse 5, 10, 11, and it says, but he was wounded for, in verse 5 says, but he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, and the chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And then verse 10 and 11 we have done read, and it says several phrases in verse or chapter 53 speak directly to the salvation the Lord provided. With his stripes we're healed, we know, and it says, "For you were sheep going astray." This is from Peter. It says, "For we are sheep going astray, but now return to the shepherd and bishop of your souls." And it says clearly Peter's use of the verse identifies Christ as both the sacrifice and the shepherd who provides salvation for those to turn to him. And it says, we have all gone astray in verse 6. It says, all we like sheep have grown astray. We have turned away everyone to his own way. And the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. So the need for salvation is all of us, and we talked about that before when we went over this. All of us naturally want to go our own way. We want to go do what we want to do. We're going to be seeking self till we die. We'll always be seeking self. I don't know if it's in us to not do that. At some point in our lives, we're always going to be seeking self, and to our demise every time. You know, we're usually when we go after just trying to please ourselves, and that's all that we're trying to please, then we'll never get to where we need to be, and we will absolutely never come to see our need for Christ if we're always seeking ourselves. But it says here in the bottom part of this, part C, it says becoming one of the seed depends on making his soul an offering for sin, that is, accepting Christ's sacrifice as one's own. It says, as noted earlier, Isaiah describes Christ's suffering as travail because it would produce born-again children. Paul used the same analogy to describe his own evangelistic work. He said, my little children, of whom I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you. Typically, for a child to be born, the mother must first experience labor and travail. Likewise, for a person to be born again, someone somewhere has to travail for that person's soul. And it says, finally, consider the following phrase: by his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many. His knowledge could refer to knowledge that the Messiah possessed, and the phrase could also refer to the knowledge of Jesus Christ that is necessary for justification. This view seems better than the first one, and certainly man needs knowledge of Christ and his redemptive work to be saved. This is an underlying idea in Romans 10. So let me go to Romans chapter 10 and verse 13 through 15. And I'll read that to you. Romans 10 verse 13 through 15, it says, and there came a voice to him, rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. And the voice spake again to him, again the second time, what God hath cleansed, that I call not common. So God...
What chapter?
Oh, I read Acts. I'm sorry. I was thinking, what in the world am I reading? That's what I was thinking the whole time. Yeah, I read Acts. I'm sorry. Oh, let me go back. I was thinking, how's that tie in? Okay, chapter 10, verse 13 through 15 of Romans. It said, for whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him in whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach except they be sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things. Said God provided salvation for all people, both Jew and Gentile. However, they have to know about this salvation before they can accept the offer. And God has designed that people should hear the gospel from others who have already accepted Christ. And they will be the people that have already accepted Christ will be the ones who spread the gospel. Not only preachers and not only missionaries and everything. It's on all of us to spread the gospel. It talks about here some in the very end of this lesson. And go over that now. Why it's how is it? It's got a question there. It says, "Why so afraid? What is it about the gospel message that makes us so afraid to share it? What is it that makes us nervous to share the message with other people?" I think that's a question for every generation that's ever walked on earth. What makes it so hard? Is it because it's so personal? Is it that it's the probably most personal thing you can say to someone? Is the share the message of Christ? Is it because it's so personal that some people have trouble talking about it? Is it just because I don't like public speaking? I don't like it. I've never been good. Don't like public speaking. Is it scared to go knock on somebody's door because nowadays, I'm sure it's always been that way, is probably worse. And probably worse back in the older days, people would meet you at the door with a gun if they didn't know who you were. It may happen now, but probably not as much as it did then, because it was a lot more rural back then. If somebody showed up you didn't know, you was on guard immediately back then. But nowadays, it's just it's not as much of a threat. It's just the I guess getting out of your own comfort zone, and then being able to talk to someone like that. I can say to myself, I am terrible at coming up to people I don't know and talking to them about anything. So, and this to me is a super personal part of someone's life, and but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It really does not. I think it's one of those things we just need to. A lot of churches do. What is that called? They'll do like meetings with they teach their members how to do that, how to be more, how to easily do that more.
It's like an outreach.
Yeah, and they like the churches will teach the members, or I don't know if it's a men's movement or a women's thing or whatever, discipleship training. Is that what it's called? Is it kind of like that you would go out and you kind of teach people how to do those things the proper way, you know? But the Bible, it also, there's so many examples in the Bible of talking about how to do those things, even to the can't remember what part it is, and I'm sure, Nathan, you can catch me on this, where he talks about going into the city and if you're rejected or whatever, wipe the dust off your feet and move on. And I've always kind of, and I may be wrong in my assessment of that, but I've always thought is you could tell someone the gospel if they're not willing to accept it, if they don't want to hear you. It's no sweat off you. Just keep moving, keep going on to the next person, you know. And once you've shared the gospel with them, you can go on. I know Jimmy used to talk about a guy he worked with, drove a forklift, would jump off the forklift and witness to people at work all the time. That's not me, but I mean, and there's some people that can do that, and I don't know how I would react or how I would do if someone did that to me. So I don't know. There's a certain place when you reach the certain person. There's I always feel like there is a certain. You hit somebody that is wanting to hear it at the right time, at the right place, and everything works perfect. And we don't know when that right time is. I don't know what nobody in here is thinking right now, and I may have the exact word for someone at the right time, and the rest of you, it doesn't mean nothing to you. So I think that's got a lot to do with it as well. Okay, you want to share on that?
I've had people met with guns.
Yeah.
I've had doors slammed in my face.
Mm-hmm.
And I've led people to the Lord in their living room.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I remember when I was a kid, We went to Church of Christ in Hamilton, big church. They had all kind of people going out and visiting. They'd send a school bus through the housing projects where we lived in. They'd load it up. I mean, there would be 30 kids on there every Sunday. They'd ride around through there and pick up people. And when they would come to the house and Mama didn't want to talk to them, she'd turn the lights off. And she'd tell us not to go to the door. But yeah, I'm telling you, it's, oh, man. But anyway, it is a gospel for us to share, and the salvation, and it's such a good message. There's nothing bad can come of sharing the gospel with someone as far as what we're being accused of or anything like that. I don't think I'm better than anyone, and I don't want anyone else to think that I think I'm better than them, and that's kind of what gets into some people sometimes is you go talk to someone, they say, well, I've known you all my life, you're not any better than me at anything. So, you know, some people is going to take that stance on things, but we are still to share the gospel as much as we can, and that's the way it was laid out from the beginning, is for us to do so. But now we talk about the intercession, I guess you would say, of what Christ does for us. It says on the cross, Christ prayed, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We assume the Lord was referring to the soldiers who had nailed him to the cross. But because God laid the iniquity of us all on him, we too are responsible. It says, as you recall, Isaiah 53 was written from the view of the Jews who assessed their mistaken thoughts during the crucifixion. And for those men, Jesus' prayer was answered. They were forgiven. And then the next we get into Isaiah 53 and verse 12. It says, therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he hath poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sins of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So this is the part I was getting to, talking about the heirs. What do we know about about how things were done in that time? When a nation took over another nation, they divided, to just go off verse 12, they would divide whatever they took from that nation. As it says in a lesson here, this was currently happening to Jerusalem at this time. The Assyrians were dividing the Israelites' stuff. They were taking all their stuff. And it said, because he had poured out his soul even unto death, and for the transgressors, which is everyone, since he had died for us all, we would all, says here in the very bottom part of that Roman numeral 4 or 5, whatever that is, says, likewise believers will receive a portion of the inheritance of Christ's kingdom. We are heirs of God and joint heirs of Christ, and we will also reign with him in his millennial kingdom. Does anyone have anything to add? It talks about here a little bit in the end as well, and going back to verse 13 a little bit, and it talks about how those who rejected Christ and belittled his followers someday will acknowledge that he is the Lord, and that's everyone from this time, from the time that Christ was crucified until now. Everyone will recognize at one point exactly who he is and will understand every bit of this in chapter 53 to the very end. No one has anything. We're not going to have Sunday school next week because we're going to do breakfast and have preaching next Sunday. So the Sunday after that, we'll come back and we'll be in lesson 11 right after Christmas, so don't mess up. And that's it. We'll close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you again for this day. Thank you for your love, mercy, and grace, and for the opportunity to be here today, Lord. Ask you, Lord, to be with us through the remainder of this service and through the remainder of this week, Lord. And may we have open minds and hearts to receive your word and to follow your will. And it's in Christ's name I pray.